The Atlantic waters were calm the night that Thomas Odom set out for a solo fishing trip near Fort Fisher. It was the fall, 1988. The moon cast a silver glow across the waves as he cast his line. Thomas was enjoying the peace that only the deep night could bring. But then, that peace was shattered. A silent, triangular craft hovered over the water, barely making a sound. The only exception a low hum that sent vibrations through Thomas's chest. He froze. His fishing rod slipped from his grasp. Suddenly, a blinding column of light engulfed his boat. The sensation of being pulled upward overwhelmed him. Then, nothing. When he regained consciousness, the sun was rising. His coffee, poured hours earlier, it was still warm. But his watch, well, it showed 6 hours of his life had vanished. Thomas gathered himself, but then he began to notice fresh, circular marks on his arms, as if something had marked him. In the following weeks, well, the nightmares began. Visions of sterile rooms, figures looming over him, a sensation of floating above his own body. When Thomas finally got the nerve to tell his story, as you might believe, he was met with disbelief. But he found out he wasn't alone. Other fishermen had seen strange lights over the water, and some even admitted that they, too, had experienced missing time. For centuries, the Brown Mountain Lights have mystified those who gaze upon them. The flickering orbs, sometimes white, other times reddish orange, they appear above the Pisgah National Forest, seemingly moving with an eerie intelligence all their own. Scientists have theorized about gases, atmospheric reflections. Some even say it's seismic activity. But for those who have encountered them up close, these lights hold a far more terrifying truth. In the early 1980s, a group of 4 campers set out into the Brown Mountains. They were eager to catch a glimpse of the famous lights. They hiked deep into the forest and set up a camp on a ridge with an unobstructed view of the valley down below. As night fell, the lights, well, they appeared. First distant and bobbing, and then suddenly rushing toward them. The campers were at first completely exhilarated, and that faded as they quickly became uneasy. Then came the deafening silence. No wind, no crickets, just an unnatural stillness filled the valley. Before anyone could react, everything went totally black. Hours later, they awoke in a different section of the forest. Their sleeping bags and belongings were all scattered. The fire they had built was still smoldering, but their watches all showed 4 hours had passed. One camper, we'll just refer to him as David S., experienced months of nightmares afterwards. Visions of tall, thin figures examining him under blinding lights, his body paralyzed, unable to move, his thoughts invaded by something non-human, otherworldly. Locals whisper that the Brown Mountain Lights are more than just a natural phenomenon, that they were a beacon for something watching from above. It was a quiet September evening in 1967 when Harold Dees drove home through the back roads of Edenton, North Carolina. His old pickup truck rumbled along the dirt path. The field stretched endlessly on either side. He was only a few miles from home. That's when he saw it. A gleaming object hovering over a pasture, his metallic surface reflecting the moonlight. Thinking it was a downed plane, Harold pulled over, and as soon as he stepped out of his truck, the craft released a blinding light. Harold's entire body seized. He was paralyzed. Suddenly, shadowy figures emerged from the craft, tall, with elongated heads and thin fingers. Though their mouths never moved, Harold could hear them speaking inside his mind. Then, everything went dark. When Harold came to, he was sitting in his truck, some 20 miles away. No memory of how he got there. His gas tank, it was nearly empty. His watch, well, it indicated a total of 4 hours had passed. Harold was scared, shaking. He drove home. Later that day, he discovered small burn marks on his arms. The local sheriff, he dismissed his story. But others in town reported seeing strange lights that night as well. And nearby cattle, well, for algorithm purposes, let's just say they were found unusually agitated, as if disturbed by something unseen. Bobby Andrews loved hiking alone in the Great Smoky Mountains, often venturing into uncharted trails. But on an autumn morning in 1992, Bobby's trek into the wilderness led him straight into something beyond human comprehension. Bobby's last radio call was to the ranger station, a normal call. He reported having a great view, the weather was great, and he had plans to return by dusk. But Bobby never came back. The search team found his campsite intact, his gear untouched, but no sign of Bobby. Days later, a hunter reported finding a man wandering in a daze, almost 40 miles from Bobby Andrews' last known location. It was indeed Bobby. He was in a state of confusion, completely unable to explain what had happened. His clothes were clean, though. His boots, they showed no signs of a 40-mile trek. And the only thing he kept repeating over and over again was simply, "They let me go." When he finally spoke in full, he described a flash of light, the sensation of being weightless, and strange figures examining him in a glowing white room. The strangest part, Bobby's watch showed that only 2 hours had passed, despite the fact that he had been missing for a total of 5 days. Bobby Andrews left North Carolina soon after and has never spoke of the event again. In 2009, a truck driver named Jerry McCullen was traveling down a remote stretch of highway near Asheville, North Carolina, when his rig's electronics suddenly shut down. A brilliant light flooded the road ahead, revealing an enormous disc-shaped craft. Jerry said he exited his truck, and suddenly an unnatural stillness surrounded him. The air felt heavy, and time seemed to stretch, and his body was locked in a strange paralysis. Now later, Jerry described himself being back inside his truck, hours missing from his memory, His CB radio crackled. Another driver's frantic voice asked if he'd seen the light too. Jerry's hands trembled as he checked his watch. And just like in all the other stories tonight, it was 3 hours later than what he had remembered. Following the incident, nightmares began to plague him too. Visions floating through endless, cold, white corridors. Instruments being pressed against his skin. Inhuman eyes staring deep inside his soul. Skeptics, well, they dismissed his story too. But the strange burn marks on his arms and the magnetic interference with his truck that night, well, they remain unexplained.
In 1993, the sleepy town of Thomasville, North Carolina, became the site of a terrifying extraterrestrial encounter. Bethany Caldwell, a single mother, had just put her children to bed when a piercing hum filled the air. Looking outside, she saw an enormous triangular craft hovering above the fields behind her home. Before she could scream, her body stiffened and an invisible force pulled her skyward. Bethany awoke on a cold metal table, unable to move. Shadowy, thin figures surrounded her, their almond-shaped eyes unblinking. They communicated without speaking, showing her images of Earth's fragile future, wars, disasters, and a warning about humanity's fate. Then, as suddenly as she had been taken, she was back in her living room. Hours had passed. Strange symbols marked her wrist, and her children later spoke of glowing figures watching from their windows that night. Bethany, like the rest of us would have done, never spent another night alone on the farm.